All right, welcome to this brand new section where we're going to discuss form elements, and not only discuss, we're actually going to design our own form as well. But first we have a few slides so I can show you what form elements are. And essentially they just capture user input. Now that could be a name, an email address, that could be options from a radio button or checkboxes, etc. Now there's 6 primary form elements that we're going to go through in this video. So for the first one, this is the one that you know the most. It is the text field. All right, it's basically simply an area where you click in it and you enter data, be that your name, your last name, your email address, etc. Now, there's a label associated with it. There's also the form element itself, and then there's a optional placeholder value that you can specify here. Now, the placeholder value isn't required. That's something that's achieved through HTML with the placeholder attribute. And it's basically just to provide users with more or an actual example in terms of the type of input or the structure of the input that's required. Now, if it's something like a first name for the label, well, you really don't need to put a placeholder value here because that's pretty obvious to the user. But it could be something like a phone number, then you may want to put a placeholder value just to show you an example, show the user an example of what the phone number structure should look like. Next up are text areas, which are exactly like a text field, except it allows the user to input more data. Like if there's a sentence or a paragraph or paragraphs from which a user can put a lot of content, then you want to design for a text area. And design-wise, it's exactly the same, except it just has more height. Also, select menus, also known as a drop-down menu. Here's an example of one that's been fully expanded. When a user clicks on this item, they can hover over it. It shows the selected item by default, and then item 2, item 3, and so forth. So these all have different states, you know, the text field, the text areas, select menus, etc., and the checkboxes and the other ones that you're going to see. They also all have different states. They have a default state where the user is not interacting with it at all. They also have a focus state. For instance, like if somebody clicks into it, or if they tap it with their finger, or they use their keyboard like a tab key to navigate through the user interface, there's also a focus state that we need to design for. There's also a hover state that we can do. And let's continue talking about some more of these radio buttons. So usually has a label, and then you have option 1 or option 2. Now the thing about, let me get my head out of the way, radio buttons is that they essentially only allow you to choose one option. So if there's like a yes, no, use a radio button. Checkboxes. All right, so checkboxes, these are traditionally in a square format and not like a circle like a radio button. And they allow you to select multiple options. And then finally, buttons. We've already covered buttons, but when it comes to form elements, there needs to be a way typically to submit them, although not all forms might have a submit button. Sometimes in the case of a search button, or for instance, you might just have like an enter key, and that could be the call to action there. But buttons will obviously cover more of these in depth. So I want to talk about a few best practices or good practices that you should follow when it comes to creating form elements. So I'm using a text field to demonstrate these, but these are all applicable to other form elements as well. So placeholder visibility. If you're going to use the placeholder, you're going to design for it as a UI designer, then make sure that people can actually read it. This right here is not enough contrast. Now this right over here is too much contrast. The reason being is you don't want to have a maximum contrast because the actual value that a person specifies when they click into it, you don't want them confusing this placeholder value with being already filled in. So what happens typically when you click on or into a text field that has a placeholder and they start typing, it will automatically go away, this placeholder value. It's not actual data that's input. So you want to have something that's in the mid-range, and it also contrasts well enough with the background that it's sitting on and also with the primary text when a user starts entering text. Form visibility. All right, so the one I'm talking about, the form element here is the actual square. So you don't want to do something like this where you have a thin border and there's not much contrast based on the background. Instead, you should opt for something that is darker, like this. And also you can have a background color and not use an actual border. But this right here in this case does not contrast well enough with the white background. And instead you could do something like this. You could keep the same background color, but make sure you at least wrap it in a stroke or a border that has a few pixels here, or you can make it black, and in that case you can make it like 1 pixel. And this is just to show you all of these, these details, these guidelines, they adhere and they apply to anything that's on a dark background as well. All right, so underlined form elements is something I see people do often, and it's not something that I really recommend doing. Basically, they're taking the form element and they're only putting a border at the bottom of it. Now, this can be problematic because they've done studies on this, and some users, they're not really sure. They just think it's like a line separator or a divider. They don't know really where to click. So if you're going to do this, make sure you at least create a filled background color so that they can clearly see that this is a text area and they can click inside of it, or a text field. All right, so label alignment. Now, sometimes you may have seen this on long forms where people have a 2-column layout with the labels on the left and then the actual form elements on the right. And generally, this isn't a good practice because it creates like a zigzag pattern in terms of associating which label goes with which input field. So it creates, if we're looking at the eye movement, it's like this, it's like a zigzag. Whereas if things are on top of each other and stacked, it's a lot easier for people to make the association with the label and the input. However, also, one thing on mobile, for instance, when you're using your finger to click into and focus onto a given form element, this gives you a little bit more chance of clicking into and selecting the wrong form element because they're closer together. All right. Next up are floating labels. All right. So sometimes people will create a label just by using the placeholder value. And that is a no-go because, as you can see, if I back up a few times, a person goes in to click in it or they touch it with their finger, that label goes away, and then people will sometimes forget what that field's about. So an appropriate floating label looks like this. So you have your name, and then you click into it, and then a front-end developer uses JavaScript to physically move and animate that label into a different area. Sometimes it could be above it, or a lot of times it's also kind of right here in the middle of this stroke, and the stroke is made white so that it just says name, and there's just kind of like a cut open into this area. So you can use that as well, but make sure you're not just relying on placeholder values, and make sure that that is communicated correctly to the front-end developer.